Conflict with respect to item 3.6, the delegation from Dr. Mackey from Middlesex London Health Unit, as Middlesex London Health Unit is my employer. We'll move on to consents. Anybody wish anything pulled from the consents?
2.6.
I'll take. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I do have just a question on 2.6.
Councillor Park? You'd like pulled? No, just for questions? Okay. I will take a motion for the consents to move. Moved by Mayor Brown, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, and discussion. We've got questions from Councillor Hopkins and Councillor Park.
Thank you. And I do have a question through you, Mr. Chair, to staff on 2.6. This is a development in Ward 9. And I am wondering if just staff could speak, I guess, to the uniqueness of the subdivision. I know the Southwest Area Plan sort of dictates a lot of the development in Ward 9, and just want to make sure that it's got nothing to do with the Southwest Area Plan, and if I could just have further clarification.
Well, thank you to the chair. This is actually a subdivision that's outside the urban growth boundary. It's in a rural settlement area, and while the lands would seem to be part of the broader Lambeth community, they're actually separate and distinct from that. The Southwest Area Plan does apply to lands within the urban growth boundary for the Southwest Plan area. However, these lands are a rural settlement subdivision. We don't actually have very many of those really left in the city. This is one of the last ones that I think we'll be having of this scale.
Councillor Park.
Thank you. Just some comments on, the 560, 562 Wellington Street asked for further consultation and further exploration of secondary plan in the area. I think that this is a really good step forward about how we plan and develop in and around the Victoria Park area. I know there's a lot of people that don't want to see any sort of change in and around that area, and the secondary plan will be informed by public input, and we'll see what comes out of that process. I do have to ask, though, at this point in the game, which in my opinion, I think that the staff direction from council has been fulfilled. The property owners and staff have come together to try to attempt for a meeting of the minds, and unfortunately, it didn't get to where it was expected to. And I just wonder at what point do we just let bygones be bygones here, and council outright refuses the application and the appeal process goes forward on that. I think it's a difficult situation, recognizing that staff have done their absolute best to bring the property owner to the table to work together, and unfortunately there just wasn't a meeting of the minds there.
So, Mr. Chair, I certainly understand where the councillor's coming from on that. Our perspective is that we think that this study will give us some clarity as to how to deal with that application. So if this study were to give us some sense of heights and transitions and densities and intensity around the park, it'll give us some sense of where this particular site might snap into that bigger picture. Now, the applicant has the opportunity already to appeal based on inaction. To date, and we've had conversations, they've agreed to wait until this process comes to its conclusion. That isn't a formal binding position on their part, but certainly indicates to us that they're willing to allow this process to conclude so that we would have greater clarity to evaluate their application. So my suggestion at this point, if you're looking for our opinion specifically, would be to hold on, wait for us to get through this process before you move forward with your final decision on that application. But of course, certainly defer to what council wants to do with it.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you to staff, and I apologize for not remembering this, but can you give me a rough idea what height would be allowed there right now?
Through you, Mr. Chair, under the current zoning, 10 meters.
And roughly how many stories is that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that'd be approximately 3 to 4 stories.
Thanks very much. Through you, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to say, I'm glad that the applicant is still willing to keep talking. I agree with Councillor Park that it's still pretty much way out of the ballpark with where I think most of council sees the height around this park. And I don't know, I don't want to say I told you so, but I remember talking to staff when this came forward last time about having a more comprehensive plan for around the park. I know that we have a bunch of different plans that sort of work together, but Victoria Park is such an important asset in the middle of the city, in the heart of the city, that I think it's really great that that staff will come back with a pretty comprehensive, all-encompassing plan with a vision for how we see development around the park. And I know that there are areas that are immediately adjacent to this zone, this zone. And so I'm wondering if we would expand that. So there are some areas that are currently, we envision a tower, for example, that are right across from the park as well. So I'm wondering if when this plan is created or adopted, I'm wondering if the area would be expanded at all, if you foresee, through you, Mr. Chair, areas that might contemplate a tower right now. Do we see maybe coming down in height on certain sites in order to fit with the overall vision of the park?
Mr. Fleming.
Mr. Chair, I think that that's not off the table. I think the idea is just to understand what would height and density look like around the park and all 4 sides of the park, and give the community some certainty too by the end of this process as to where height might be expected and where it might not. Deal with interface with the park from a design point of view, but also interface with the neighborhood, and never forgetting the heritage conservation districts. And there's 2 of them that we need to make sure we're respecting as we move forward through this.
If I may just add to that, the purpose of the study is not to presuppose anything. There's a lot of planning framework to be done. This is where the confluence of several policy areas meet, but there is no policy area for the park itself. The question is, how do those have regard for each other? Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you. And I want to just say that given all the policies around the park, it's good that we're looking at a comprehensive plan, and it's good to also know that there may be a plan just for the park as well. I'm just wondering if staff, through you, Mr. Chair, have any idea of timelines or when we can expect this report coming back?
Mr. Chair, with this project, I think we'll need the assistance of a consultant just to give us those extra hands. And with that, we anticipate a Q4 of this year return back to PAC and Council for a decision.
Any further questions from the committee? Comments? All right. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you. So through you, Mr. Chair, we're often dealing with very many conflicting priorities, so I think the offer of staff to come forth with some clarity will be very helpful.
Thank you. And with that, no further comments. I'll open up the vote for consents. Items 2.1 through 2.7.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you, and we'll move on to the scheduled items. Number 3.1 is a public participation meeting with respect to archaeological management plan. If I could get a vote to open up the PPM. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Cassidy.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Great stuff. And we've got Mr. Parker and Mr. Gagnon, and it looks like Mr. Gagnon's got the podium. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to present the official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment for the archaeological management plan. I'd like to acknowledge the assistance that my colleague Chuck Parker has provided, as this is my first OPA ZBA. You mostly see me on just strictly heritage matters. For this, I just want to give an introduction to some heritage jargon. I'll be using AMP to refer to both the Archaeological Master Plan 1996 and the Archaeological Management Plan 2017. So you don't need to worry about how you're changing your phraseology. AMP will work for both. With this, we have a long legacy of artifacts within the planning department, including the Archaeological Management Plan. This is a real floppy disk. It dates to 1995, and it contains the original Archaeological Management Plan. And this is now an artifact. So in October of 2015, we received direction from Council to review the AMP. We worked on this in 2016 and 17 with the assistance of ASI and Dr. Ron Williamson. And in July of 2017, the review of the AMP and the new AMP were adopted by Municipal Council with direction to bring forward this official plan amendment and zoning bylaw amendment. As part of the AMP 2017, we're improving the compliance with legislation and provincial policy. There's been changes to the Ontario Heritage Act, the Planning Act, and also the repeal of the Cemeteries Act, which has been replaced by the Funerals, Burials, and Cremation Services Act. In addition, we see a strengthened recognition of archaeological resources from Section 2D of the Planning Act, which translates into Section 2.6 of the Provincial Policy Statement, including enhancements we last saw in the 2014 update. As part of the AMP, we've worked very closely with our colleagues throughout the corporation to provide clarity on different applications that may trigger an archaeological assessment, which was a deficiency of the 1996 AMP. We've also worked very closely to develop a contingency plan that will help to facilitate the respectful treatment of remains or resources that are identified through urgent situations. As part of the AMP, we also undertook very detailed mapping and review of our archaeological potential model. And one area that we specifically focused in was the historic core. We did very detailed mapping that overlaid and identified areas that still retain archaeological potential. And I'm happy to report that our archaeological potential model is working at a very high efficacy rate, 100% for our Indigenous archaeological resources and nearly 100% for our Euro-Canadian archaeological resources. One matter that we are continuing to work with is our local First Nations community to develop administrative processes related to engagement for archaeological assessments. You may recall those enhanced policies we are going to see coming forward as part of the London Plan. So tonight I bring forward a recommendation to delete reference to the AMP 1996 from the official plan and the London Plan and replace that with reference to the AMP 2017 in both official plan and the London Plan. We're also recommending a changing to the wording of the H18 in the zoning bylaw to bring it into compliance with current practice and legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gagnon. Any questions of a technical nature from the committee? For clarity, during the pre-PEC consultation meeting, I did ask about the H18 zoning changes. Anything that is currently has an H18 on it, notwithstanding the changes, the existing wording would apply to those applications currently in place, and those that came afterwards and had the H18 applied would have the new conditions applied to it. With one question, Mr. Mayor,
I'm just wondering if we actually have a device, a disk drive that can run that floppy disk somewhere within the City of London.
Always in search of retaining those heritage technologies, but rest assured that the 1996 Archaeological Master Plan is available in the original print copy in an archival quality, I would say, and it has been transferred to digital. It's backed up.
I was wondering the same thing. All right, any further technical questions from the committee? Seeing none, I would look to community. Any stakeholders or community members wishing to speak on this? We've got a couple mics and 15 minutes to kill. All right, I'll ask a second time and one third time. Seeing none, I'll take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Mayor Brown. We'll open up the vote right now. Mr. Barrett.
Sorry, through the chair, I just want to clarify one point on the H18. There's no grandfathering. It will be a new H18 provision. It would be applied in its new wording the next time there's an application coming in. So the H18, as you see it in the bylaw, would be replaced by this one. It's when it comes in new, this wording will apply, just to clarify.
What Greg said.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Fantastic. I'll look to the committee for any discussion or questions otherwise. Councillor Helmer.
I wanted to say thank you to our staff through the chair for this work. I know it's been a significant undertaking. I know we had the draft before us months ago, and I'm glad to see it finally coming home. It's a really good step forward, I think, in terms of the archaeological master plan. And I know along the way that Mr. Yanchula was involved. I know he's in a different role now, but I'm sure he's following along on YouTube.
Any further? Seeing none, I'll take a motion to, I imagine Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Helmer, the staff recommendation. And we'll put that up on the board.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
All right, with that, we'll move on to item 3.2, public participation meeting with respect to 200 Village Walk Boulevard. I'll take a motion to open the public participation meeting, moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. We'll open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Ms. Knierim.
All right, so we have an application here for 200 Village Walk. 200 Village Walk, it is in the community that is northwest of Sunningdale and Richmond. This property fronts onto Village Walk and is just north of Sunningdale. Currently it's vacant, and there's a 4-story professional office building that you'll see here that's currently under construction on the site. The site itself is approximately ½ hectare in size. So surrounding the site, to the north, we have a minor variance that was approved in 2017 for cluster townhouses, and we also have a future park. To the west, we have townhouses. To the south, we have 2 14-story buildings. Further south, we have single detached homes. To the southeast, we have an application for a draft plan of subdivision that's currently under appeal to the Ontario Municipal Board. And east, on the opposite side of Village Walk, we have a site plan for a commercial plaza. So the site itself in the London plan is the Main Street Place type. In the 1989 official plan, it's a multifamily medium density residential residential designation, but it's also subject to the Sunningdale North area plan, where it's part of the mixed use area overlay. So that's how it's got its office permissions. And then it's zoned residential R6 R5 special provision, residential R7 special provision, and office special provision zone. So the current zoning only limits the use to professional offices. So what they're coming in for is to allow medical dental offices with a maximum square footage of 790 square meters. They're also proposing 88 parking spaces when 114 are required. They're seeking increased maximum front yard setback, an increased maximum interior side yard setback, and an increased maximum height. But these were also previously approved. The front yard, interior side yard, and height variances were previously approved through minor variance applications with regard to the subject site as a professional office use. But because we're changing the use, we have to go through and change them now too. So I've had 3 community members contact planning staff. The concerns is that the use isn't appropriate, the parking isn't sufficient, and the height and setbacks aren't appropriate. But in certain instances, this was alleviated when it was explained that these had previously been approved. So in terms of issues and considerations, one was the use. The medical dental office use will help to, in my opinion, create a more active street frontage than the professional office uses, which contributes to the Main Street place type, making it a vibrant mixed-use area. In terms of form, the increased heights and setbacks were already permitted for professional office use, and they'll help to continue to contribute to a street-oriented development with a height compatible with the surroundings. And in terms of parking, Transportation Services has reviewed the parking quantity proposed and found it to be acceptable. And then it's anticipated that in the future, since it's a vibrant mixed-use area, there may not be as much of a need for parking. So it's recommended to change the zoning of the subject property from residential R6 special provision, residential R7 special provision, and office special provision to residential R6 special provision, residential R7 special provision, and office special provision with a different special provision for the office. The special provisions would be for medical dental offices up to 790 square meters, front yard setback of a maximum of 4 meters, an interior side yard setback from the Sunningdale Road Reserve of a maximum of 16.1 meters, a height of 15 meters, and a minimum of 88 parking spaces. And again, maximum gross floor area for medical dental of 790 square meters.
Thank you. I'll look to the committee for any questions of technical nature. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want clarification. The setbacks and the heights are already pre-approved under the current office zoning. So by adding the provision for medical dental offices, is the parking different? So is there a minimum requirement under a medical office? It's 114. Was it a different minimum requirement under the regular office designation?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it was previously a different requirement for office. There is more parking required for medical dental offices than for standard offices. In terms of the previous office permissions, they previously had gone to the committee for a reduction in the parking to allow 72 spaces. I believe they were previously required to have approximately 90 spaces. And so then now they're coming in to go from 114 to 88. And in order to accommodate that 88 spaces, they've gone through a consent application that they've got a provisional approval for to sever a portion of the property to the north and make it part of this site in order to accommodate the access and the additional parking, increase the number of parking spaces.
Further questions? One quick question myself, if I might, is I'd imagine because there's a series of things that need to be done, the rezoning change and other things, that's why we're set to consider the setbacks, which would normally go through committee of adjustment, or why wouldn't they go through committee of adjustment to obtain those once we provided the rezoning?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, just basic, because of the change in use, they have to come in and get these setbacks to allow to be associated with this use. They could come in just for the use change and then go to the Committee of Adjustment for a minor variance for the setbacks, but because they've come in for rezoning, it's much more efficient for them to do it all as a package.
If I could add, the community gets confused often when we have multiple applications on the same property. So it's not only better for the applicant, speeding things along, but also better for the community.
Makes a lot of sense to me. I just wanted to make sure we weren't usurping our delegated committee. I appreciate that. Thanks. Any further questions? Okay. I'd look to the community for any questions. Yes, sir. There's a microphone right here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Boxman. I live at 240 Village Walk Boulevard, the Tricar building that is just to the south of this site. The planning committee, when they amended the policy for our building, decided in their wisdom to give us 12 visitors parking spots for a 150-unit condominium building. And the building that is in process next door is also 150 units. So we currently have situations on holidays, special weekends, where we have in excess of 20 cars parked on the road because there's insufficient parking for our two high-rise buildings. I certainly am not opposed to this building being zoned for a dental building because I'm one myself, retired, thank goodness, at this point. But I just find it unusual, and I'm totally against the fact of reducing the parking that's required for this site. Just for your education, let's take our old office as an example. In the north end of the city, because the rents are so high, dental offices run in approximately in the 70% overhead range. And so many of us get together to have a better efficient use of space and try to decrease or mitigate that overhead cost. So in this building, if we're looking at, 8,503 square feet, a portion of that being dental office, I foresee that probably it will be a group practice going into that building. So just to handle the parking for that alone, irrespective of everything else that's involved with that building, let me just run you through the statistics for our past practice, running just 2 dentists, okay? So in our practice, we had 2 dentists, we had 3 office receptionists, 1 office manager, 4 hygienists, 2 dental assistants, 1 floater, 8 patients in those operatories at one time, and at least 8, if not more, waiting in the waiting room. So just for a 2-person dental practice, we would need approximately 30 parking spots. So I would like to go on record that I do not support this application as far as reducing the number of parking spots. I think that is the wrong way to go, since we already south of Sunningdale have massive parking problems because of the 2 high-rise buildings that Tricar has built. And so sometimes people from our area south of Sunningdale already park on the street to the north of Sunningdale. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? Yes, sir. Just name your name and address for the committee.
Mike, 246 Callaway Road. I'm with Domus Development, the applicant. Just to give you a heads up, it's not a there's just 1 dentist going in there on the main floor. And just give you some perspective, it's a 4-story building. We're only going in for just 1 level of dental. The upper 3 floors are already leased out for office professional. Our office is going there. We take 3,000 square feet and have 4 cars. So the office component really is not going to be very intense in how much parking they take. We know the dental will take more, and that's why we added that severance to add in more parking for that basic reason. And all of our people that sign our leases, they have a certain amount of parking spots they're allowed. So they're aware of what their parking allowance is. I do know what he's talking about across the road where they park on the road. We have nothing to do with that, and you're looking at a residential versus an office component. But yeah, just want to put that out there, just to give you kind of a perspective.
Thank you. And you're representing the applicant, and are you agreeing with the recommendation from staff?
Of course.
Thank you. Any further discussions? Okay. Seek one more time. And one final call. Seeing none, I will take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Mayor Brown, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Okay, to the members for discussion. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for staff based on the conversation around the reduction of parking. We often see applications come before this committee asking for a reduction in the required parking spaces. And I know we have formula that, you know, say what kind of use and how much parking is required generally. So I'm wondering if we ever go back at, especially applications where we've approved a reduction in parking, do we ever go back and look and see how's that working to inform going forward in the future, not only our formula, but also for when we're dealing with requests for a reduction?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Based on our calculations for the office building, if it was all office building, it would require about 81 spaces. That's based in the Institute of Transportation Engineer trip generation manual. So we thought, but by adding some component to it, it's about 100, and the transportation staff sees it's reasonable to have about 88 parking spot for this building. Sorry. So no, we haven't come back and looked after that. No, we didn't. Thank you. Sorry.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess it might be something like on a case-by-case basis if the ward councillor is made aware, but I just think it's something that if we see a problem in an area, I know we've heard of a number of different office buildings often. I know we put in like paid parking at one site because of the experience that had gone on at another site. So I guess that's just the way we'll handle it forever, is dealing with it as issues come up.
One thing I'd point out is we're looking at, and we have to legislatively revise the zoning bylaw. And so that's going to be happening over the next 3 years. It's required after you do a comprehensive official plan amendment, or new official plan as we have. And so that's an opportunity through that zoning study to take a good hard look at parking standards. I think that the London plan is trying to get away from an auto-dominated urban environment. However, at the same time, making sure that we take care of requirements for parking. And one last piece, I think, of perspective is that it's always, I think, useful to look at what would be the implication if there is insufficient parking on site. What would happen? Is there going to be significant impact on neighborhood? Or in this case, for example, there is a commercial plaza right across the street. So can less parking on one site, if it ends up being deficient, maybe be accommodated elsewhere?
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, just taking a look here on the staff recommendation, there's a note that said it'd be introduced at the next council meeting on May 22nd. Just trying to pull up to see if the bylaw says that as well. May 8th. Okay, so we just need to change the recommendation that it be introduced on May 8th rather than the 22nd. But I would look for a motion to, actually we need to close the public participation. Did we do that? We did. Okay, thank you. To get the recommendation on the floor. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Helmer. With the amendment.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Very good, thank you. And that moves us on to item 3.3, the public participation meeting with respect to the London Plan and downtown plan criteria for downtown temporary surface commercial parking. I'll take a motion to open the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Call the vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This item before you...
Just 1 second, Mr. Parker. Okay. Just have to call the vote here. Just need your mic, too.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
The next item on the agenda is the downtown parking lot review. In September of 2015, council had been getting a lot of requests from developers to indicating that they were running out of properties in order to develop not only apartment buildings, but also commercial development in the downtown. Instead of looking at vacant lands, they were looking at tearing down existing buildings to forward their development plans. So council raised this in their resolution of September 15th, 2015. They asked us to go and review the existing status of parking lots in the downtown, all commercial parking lots in the downtown, and asked us to see if they were zoned appropriately. The second component of the resolution was to look at the London Plan policies and the downtown master plan policies and make sure that they were consistent in terms of discouraging the extension of temporary zoning bylaws on the properties for which commercial temporary parking lots were permitted. They also asked us to look evaluation of new applications and applications for new commercial temporary parking lots, and also the extension of existing temporary parking lots. And they also asked us, as part of Clause C, to prepare a downtown parking strategy. Our report on temporary surface commercial parking lots was prepared in conjunction with the downtown parking strategy study. The downtown parking strategy study took quite some time. It was a comprehensive study of not only temporary parking lots, but also the management of parking lots, parking garages, alternatives, how to deal with on-street parking, so on and so forth. It was a multi-issue strategy. It was started in October of 2015, and it was completed in December of 2017. And both our report and the downtown parking strategy went to PEC, came before this committee on December 4th, 2017. As a result of the review of those two reports, council made another resolution. They asked us under Clause A to initiate an official plan amendment to include official plan criteria in not only the existing official plan, but also the London plan, and to also put those criteria within the downtown plan. Under Clause B, they asked us to amend our Move Forward London's downtown plan. And in C was a direction to our bylaw enforcement group to look at proactively advising owners and operators to get business licenses for existing parking lots. This report addresses clauses A and B, and bylaw enforcement will address Clause C. The criteria that we included were included in our original report on December 4th, but as part of the official plan amendment process, we've included those not only in the existing official plan language, but also recommending to be included in the London plan language as well as the guideline document, our Move Forward, the downtown plan. And just to hit the highlights of what the criteria address. The first one deals with the need for surface parking in the area. The second criteria is the importance of pedestrian streetscapes and making sure that the surface parking lot does not interfere with the pedestrian flow across the frontage of the property. The size of the parking lot is the third criteria. Fourth, the length of time that the existing surface commercial parking lot has been in place. any applicable guideline documents that may apply to parking lots as well. The sixth was the site plan approval be required for any parking lots going forward. And then the seventh criteria is where council does not wish to extend the temporary parking for a certain period of time, that some time be given to allow alternative parking arrangements to be made for prospective users. That's the extent of the presentation. Be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I'll look to the committee for any questions of technical nature. Seeing none, seeing none at this time. I will look up to the audience. Is there anybody wish to speak? Come on down, there's a mic. Just need your name and address. If you don't wish to provide those, the clerk can come up and grab them from you later.
Jennifer Granger, 520 Wellington Street. I'm president of ACO London, and on behalf of ACO, which is the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario London branch, I'd just like to state that ACO supports the goal of replacing the surface parking lots with development that would include underground or above ground parking, rather than tearing down heritage properties for a development. It seems to us that developers and investors are often just sitting on parking lots that they own for years until they finally decide to build or sell the land for development. We noticed Camden Terrace on Talbot Street was torn down by Rygar Developments to build a high-rise. We're still waiting for them to begin building the high-rise. But the situation might have been avoided if there had been more surface lots available for them to build on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Granger. Look to any further comments. I'll ask again. And I'll look one third time. Seeing none, I'll take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Park. We'll open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. I'll look to the panel here. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm supportive of this moving forward for many reasons. I won't go on and on about them, but it feels to me that in downtown in particular, we're at a standpoint where the private sector, the public sector are almost waiting for someone to blink first about who's going to build a parking structure in the downtown. So I wonder, as a council going forward, how can we work together? What kind of incentives can we possibly offer in the future to either through a private-public partnership to get a parking structure in the downtown in the higher needs areas? And I wonder if staff can comment on that.
Everybody's looking at each other. Looks like Mr. Fleming has the mic.
Well, I'll ask Mr. Almadoun to stand on deck here, talk about the parking strategy specifically. So the parking strategy did cover this subject area and indicated that a parking garage is required, and there was a time frame, and I can't recall exactly what it was, but it was something like within the next 5 years, 7 years, something along those lines. So it certainly is something that in the strategy, we indicated that we'd be looking for potential partnerships. So while there isn't something specifically in our budget that relates to incentives or something that's really direct, the strategy did provide an overarching intention to develop a parking structure in the downtown, and it identified where that was most needed. I don't know if Mr. Almadoun has something further to add. The only thing that I would add is that if council wanted to be more deliberate, more directive, they certainly could do that. But the context, I think, is the parking strategy, and that would be the right forum to have maybe further discussion if that's what council wanted to have.
So through you, Mr. Chair, based on the strategy, it did not really recommend a standalone parking garage. It's more of a parking structure within a development. And, asked staff that whenever there is an opportunity as a joint venture with developers to add parkings in certain zones within the downtown based on occupancy rates. And it did show a few locations where parking utilization is almost at capacity, and other areas of downtown where there is excess of parking lots that can still be, from a temporary zone perspective, doesn't have to stay. So that is really the main thing with respect to parking requirements.
Thank you. This certainly should be a point of talk, I think, going into the next multi-year budget process. It's certainly not a conversation to be had today.
Further questions or comments? Councillor Helmer.
I support the criteria that are recommended. We've sort of been applying them in the absence of having policy. We've been kind of thinking through these exact same issues as we've dealt with the various requests for temporary zoning renewals. And I think this is the kind of balancing that we need to take when we're looking at what's the need for this kind of surface parking, where is it exactly, how big is it? I think these are all the right criteria, so I'm glad we're including that in our official plan policies. It's great.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a question about the enforcement part of it. So I know that there was one application for an extension that came before us, and we debated it quite extensively. And I know one of the issues with that particular site was a landscaping requirement, and in that there was some parking spaces like right on the city right of way, and what was a requirement under the site plan for this particular temporary parking lot was that there be some landscaping there, and this had been sort of ignored over I think about 8 years. So with that particular site in mind, I'm just wondering through you, Mr. Chair, how we're going forward, how we're going to enforce some of these site plan requirements that have been ignored by these temporary lots.
Mr. Yeoman.
Through you, Mr. Chair, so as the draft zoning provisions and policies state, and our site plan control bylaw states, site plan control is required for all of these commercial parking lots. We will be, of course, entering into agreements with the relevant applicants for these properties. We then sign off on those agreements and we take securities. We're looking at how we can enhance our security provisions in order to make sure that sufficient carrots are in place to actually affect the change that that's been asked for through the agreement and the approved site plan.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you. And so going backward for sites that have been for a long time ignoring what their requirements are, do we have a plan in place for making them comply?
Through the chair, we've had a number of sites, even when we went through this earlier go around on the temporary, actually on the parking strategy, we identified there was a number of unlicensed commercial lots out there that we were actually, some were in litigation and some were actually being forced to come in to comply with the applicable zoning, licensing, and site plan requirements. So there's a lot of those still in the hopper, and some of them take quite a bit of time to resolve.
Any further questions or comments? Councillor Van Holst, sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, through you. Just want to say that surface parking lots aren't all bad. We're looking at a film strategy for London, well, a screen-based industry strategy, and we've found out that surface parking lot can be like gold because you can put a whole bunch of trailers on it. So any kind of on-street parking or even off can be a big advantage for London, because in places like Toronto, they don't have a lot of that. So it does have a value. And myself, I think when I think about searching for things, I'm probably looking for a parking spot more often than I am looking for my keys or my phone. And so it is, it'll be great if we do make sure that we've got enough for downtown. I'm just noticing that last July, Guelph okayed a $20 million parking garage, 500 spots almost. Pretty nice to have something like that downtown if we could get it, or at least that much parking, however it could happen. So thank you.
Anything further? Seeing none, I have a couple quick questions if I might. One, the concern that I've raised before is when we contemplate not extending a surface parking lot provision, the amount of notice that we give to the owners of that lot. So I would hope that as an application or the extension, sorry, the permit period is coming close to expiry, that there's that opportunity to say, to weigh the criteria. It would be typical and consistent with what we do with other development applications, where I'd imagine you sit down and talk with the applicant and say, well, due to these reasons, we'll probably not be recommending the reissuance or the extension of the temporary parking permit. And that what that means from the point of our standpoint, if we accept that recommendation and not extend it, then is the day that that's passed by council the following week, does that parking lot cease to operate? How does that transition into operating to not operating?
So, Mr. Chair, we were aware of that issue as well, and it's the operator that we're concerned about. It's also the people that park there that work downtown or patronize the downtown that we're also concerned of. So that's where criteria number 7 or clause number 7 under the policy comes from. It says where council does not wish to extend the temporary zoning for a surface commercial parking lot, a short-term extension of the temporary zone may be permitted for the purpose of allowing the users of the lot to find alternative parking arrangements. So it's a tool for you to use if you want to extend for 6 months or 3 months or whatever that time period is, in order to allow the operators to adjust and also to allow people that park in that lot to find alternative places to park.
When I read that one, my concern with it was that would be seen as an extension, and at the end of that 6 months, they would apply again for another extension. So would it be like one final extension to allow for that as a special provision, or would it just be another kind of by the same token, the same administrative routine as extending?
So, Mr. Chair, you're right that it's not 100% perfect, that policy, and what you need to understand is you can't bind future council decisions with a decision, but if you're making your decision based on clause 7, so that's why we provide it as a policy, you can now pull that policy out of the plan and say, we're giving you an extension of this amount of time under this policy for the purposes of allowing yourself to figure out how you're going to wind this down, and also allowing your patrons to find alternative parking arrangements. So there's something at least to give that time frame for everybody to adjust.
Very good, thank you very much. Any further questions before we look for a motion? Seeing none, I'll look for a motion. I believe the staff recommendation, moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. Any further debate? Seeing none, we'll call the vote. Councillor Park. Councillor Park.
We'll go old school, yay.
Councillor Park votes yay manually.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. And we'll move forward to item 3.4, which is public participation meeting for Old East Village Dundas Street Corridor Secondary Plan, draft terms of reference. I'll take a motion to open the public participation meeting. Moved by Mayor Brown, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. I'll open the vote.
I'll vote manually, yay.
Thank you.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
All right, welcome. The podium is yours, Mr. Parker.
Chair. The next item on the agenda is the Old East Village Dundas Street Corridor Secondary Plan. Before you tonight is a draft terms of reference for a proposed secondary plan. The secondary plan came about primarily because the proposed BRT corridor heading to East London travels along King Street and portions of Dundas Street. And because of that, and the London Plan policies, which encourage an intensification of land use along those corridors, we felt that there was a need to do a secondary plan for that particular corridor. A secondary plan has some advantages. It provides more detailed guidance than general policies in the London Plan. It's also a way to coordinate development of an area and integrate a series of different initiatives that are going on. The area is experiencing a number of changes. There's lots of things going on in East London right now. The London Plan designates the corridor as a rapid transit corridor place type, which, as I said, encourages higher density residential development and commercial development along the corridor. Also, the planned construction of the rapid transit corridor creates opportunities for other things to occur along that corridor. There's stops proposed, there's infrastructure improvements, so on and so forth. There's also a east-west cycle route proposed through Old East Village, which will connect to our larger cycling network around the city. The reconstruction of the Dundas Street underground services and streetscape also presents an opportunity to integrate the secondary plan with the development in the area, both above and below ground. The possibility of an Adelaide Street CPR rail underpass could also be integrated with the secondary plan. Although it occurs somewhat north of the property, it does incorporate more traffic flow and some urban design perspectives around the railway underpass, sorry. It also gives us an opportunity to deal with the revitalization of the Western Fair Market and its integration with the secondary plan area. It provides a vehicle to deal with redevelopment applications in the area, as well as any heritage preservation issues of buildings that are worthy of heritage preservation within that corridor. It also allows us to deal with a greening plan for the area as well. That will be incorporated within the secondary plan policies. The secondary plan can knit all of these considerations together for the corridor and give us a more detailed policy context for its future development. Just to give you an idea of the study area that we're looking at, it essentially stretches all the way from the boundaries of the downtown plan all the way out to the McCormick plan. So it includes the corridors along King Street, and it also includes the Dundas Street corridor as well. So it's a pretty big area, but it's an elongated area. So there is a focus to it, but it is quite a large area. Some of the issues that we've identified at this preliminary stage deal with identifying where redevelopment should occur and where we should be looking at retention of existing buildings. There has been issues raised about the consistency with the existing community improvement plan that apply to that area. Height is an issue as to whether we're going to look at medium-rise buildings or more higher-rise buildings like the medallion structures. Our council adopted an Old East Village commercial design manual in 2016, and we'll be looking at expanding that urban design framework to the entire secondary plan area. One of the other issues we'll be looking at is the interface between tall buildings and lower density residential neighborhoods. Right to the north of the commercial district is an HCD, and there has to be some sensitivity included, which will deal with any tall buildings that are proposed adjacent to that lower density residential area. One of the other issues we'll be looking at is design guidance for any public project the city undertakes in that area or any other agency. As I mentioned, the integration with the overall city cycling network. One of the big ones is the pedestrian connections between King Street and Dundas Street. If the BRT runs down King Street, there was a concern raised by the Oldies Village BIA that people won't visit Dundas Street, the commercial businesses on Dundas Street. So there has to be some sort of pedestrian design concept which encourages people to integrate with the commercial establishments on Dundas. There's also the issue of the impact of the music, entertainment, and culture district study on the secondary plan. One of the goals of the culture district study was to make that corridor more lively, include outdoor patios, more music, more live entertainment, more street festivals, so on and so forth. And part of that can be integrated within the secondary plan as well. As I mentioned, the proximity of the Oldies Village Heritage Conservation District and the pedestrian connections to that as well is not only dealing with the height interrelationship, but also the pedestrian interaction. I mentioned the green plan for Oldies Village. There has been a desire on behalf of the commercial group that there be more of a greening of that area of the city. One of the other challenges we have is the narrow road allowance of Dundas between Adelaide and Ontario streets, and what types of things we look at doing within that corridor. We're facing the same situation with Dundas Street and trying to incorporate as many positive features within the Dundas corridor as possible without making it too crammed and overdeveloped. And then lastly, the issue of infrastructure renewal and how that has an impact on the land uses in the area and also the activity that occurs in the area. This is the process that we've identified up front for the study. It's kind of intense and compact. After approval of the terms of reference this month, the last day, we're looking to have the final secondary plan in front of you by December of 2018. So it's a pretty short time frame to do all the public meetings, do the background research, hold workshops with the community, draft the secondary plan and hold some public meetings on it, and finalize the plan. So it's a pretty tight time frame. And the reason we're on such a tight time frame is because right now I understand that the Dundas infrastructure improvements are intended to go forward in January of 2019, the study anyways, with the construction beginning in 2020. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any.
Thank you. I'll look to the committee for any questions of a technical nature. Seeing none at this point, I will look to the gallery. Does anyone wish to speak to this? I see one. Come on down and mic's available for you.
Surprise. Hello, everyone. My name is Jen Pastorius. I manage the Oldies Village BIA, and I'm also an Oldies Village resident. I'm happy to be here today to speak to the Oldies Village Secondary Plan Terms of Reference. First, I'd like to thank John and his team, and Edward Soldo and his team for their early and collaborative work on this project. When we're talking about infrastructure and development projects in Oldies Village, there is a lot going on. Adelaide Grade Separation EA has just had its last public information center before moving into detailed design. Rapid transit lanes have been designated for King and Dundas. The work to replace 100 years of infrastructure on Dundas in the village will be completed in the next coming weeks, and there are multiple potential residential and commercial developments being proposed or planned. The Oldies Village Secondary Plan and its terms of reference acknowledge these other large-scale projects, private and city projects, and the relationship to the Oldies Village, which is so important in identifying opportunities for improvements that are timely and coordinated. This report lists for review many such potential improvements, of which were highlighted in the presentation. So we are pleased to support the recommendation to endorse the terms of reference. It's exciting to work with planning and engineering to review potential opportunities for improvements in the area. The last time Dundas streetscape changed this significantly was the straightening of the Dundas curve. For those of you who are not around for the curve, it was quite a long time ago, so probably about 20 years. So we're very excited about this work. So as you can imagine, the BI is pleased to assist in this process and moving forward to work with City Staff Council and our community association to encourage the Old East Villagers to get out, get involved in shaping this comprehensive and potentially transformative secondary plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further speakers? I'll look again. I'll call one more time. Thank you very much. With that, I'll look for a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Park.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. I'll look for comments or questions. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, and I hope my colleagues will support the staff recommendation. As Ms. Pastorius just said, there is a lot going on in Old East Village, and making sure that we come together as a community to talk about what changes are going to happen and sort of what we're hoping to see in terms of the vision for that area is going to be important. There are a lot, just when you look at infrastructure projects, there's a lot going on. The condition of some of that infrastructure is deteriorating pretty rapidly. I was just walking across some alligator cracked pavement on Dundas Street, and I'm glad that the timeline is as aggressive as it is, because to coordinate the secondary planning with the infrastructure renewal requirements, that's the stuff you see above ground. Underground, we know we just replaced a 100-year-old sewer further down on Dundas Street, and there's some infrastructure needs underground as well. I'm glad to see that the report has come forward with the kind of focus that it has on the streetscape, the needs around infrastructure renewal, and then also giving a bit more clear guidance on heights and density and things like that are otherwise articulated in the London plan. But I think we've seen proposals already further down the street on Dundas at 809, and then there might be some more coming forward that are pushing the limits in terms of height. And so I think having some discussion about that at a bigger picture level that's separate from any one particular application will be really helpful. There are a lot of consultations underway in the area, and I think Jen knows that better than anyone. But I think having a clear timeline about what we're talking about and when are these things going to happen is going to be really helpful. People can understand what's going on and how they're going to engage in that. And thank our staff for bringing this report forward as quickly as they have. I know there's a lot of things in the work plan. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to endorse this going forward. I see this as a good opportunity to kind of almost replicate the great walkability that you have north of Dundas within the neighborhood and pull people out of the neighborhood onto rapid transit, because I would say that those two kind of go hand in hand. We're not just wanting to encourage people to come into the Old East Village to visit, but we also want to encourage those in Old East Village to use transit. I think that another good opportunity to bring in those design guidelines that this council already approved in the area, and I think that, as Councillor Helmer said, there's a lot of hard work that has to be done, and it's been really great to see the Old East Village throughout the turmoil of the construction along Dundas Street, how everybody just really pulled together. And it's an interesting neighborhood because you can go from store to store and you see each and every other business owner's products in the store. So all in all, it's a great project to move forward, and look forward to seeing it all come to fruition.
Thank you. I'll look for further comment. All right, seeing none, I'll look for a motion. Moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. No further discussion. I will open up the vote.
I'll vote manually, yay.
Mayor has indicated a manual yay.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you very much. We need to take a 5-minute recess because our next public participation meeting is scheduled for 5:15. It's currently 5:11. A 4-minute recess now, moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. All in favor? Okay. And we're recessed for 4 minutes. We'll be back at 5:15. All right, committee, we're at 5:15. And that brings us to the next public participation meeting, not to be held before 5:15, the application for 100 Kellogg Lane. I will look to the committee to open the public participation meeting, moved by Councillor Cassidy, second by Councillor Park. Votes coming open.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pompili, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This next application relates to a property at 100 Kellogg Lane. The specific zoning bylaw amendment that we're dealing with affects only the southern portion of this property. So the requested ZBA is really to clarify the range of accessory uses that are permitted in association with uses that were considered by council back in October of 2017. At the time of that planning application, in June 17, when the application was submitted, the vision and the specific range of uses for the adaptive reuse of the former manufacturing facility had not been fully realized. The planning application that was submitted by the applicant was processed based on a broad range of residential, commercial, and light industrial uses for that adaptive reuse of that existing industrial building. The nature and the extent of the uses intended for the portion of the buildings proposed for the commercial recreation establishment evolved during the planning process after submission of that planning application. Prior to and at the public participation meeting, the applicant had described their vision for the space as an entertainment-type center, which was beyond the scope of the commercial recreation establishment use that was listed in the application. This enhanced vision was not captured by either the applicant or staff prior to the adoption of that zoning bylaw. Civic Administration has initiated this technical housekeeping change to the zoning bylaw to recognize two uses that were contemplated by the applicant in October of 2017. However, the identified uses were not specifically listed in the amending zoning bylaw. So the recommendation that's before you this evening is a technical amendment to the light industrial special provision LI1 bracket 19 zone that was approved by council. The amendment to this special provision zone will allow for a place of entertainment and an amusement game establishment, both in association with commercial recreation uses. The commercial recreation use is a listed permitted use, and it was part of that original amendment back in October of 2017. If you have any questions, council will be happy, or Mr. Chair and committee will be happy to answer any.
Thank you very much. I'll look to the committee to see if there's any questions. Seeing none at this time, is there a representative from the applicant here? I imagine they are in accord with the recommendations here as they've asked for them. And I would look to the community for any discussion. Anybody wish to speak? We have 4 microphones and 11 minutes to kill. All right, seeing none, I will take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Helmer. We'll open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you, and I look to the committee for any discussion. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, and I know this is a relatively small change to allow these additional uses in association with the commercial recreation. I understand why we need to do it, but it does give me an opportunity to just remind everyone how amazing this project is, that it happens to be in Ward 4, and that things seem to be coming along really, really well. I know that they've been posting all the different things that are happening, you know, reconstruction of the new entrance around the back. They're talking about, you know, people who are kind of be coming in to provide food. And I know, for example, that the fellow who runs Toscanos, which happens to be in Ward 3, is now looking to come and set something up in the factory. So I think it's really proving to be a very great project. I know this little piece here needs to be tidied up. When we dealt with this earlier on, I think it was in October, I said at that time that the community is really supportive of the reuse, and that certainly still is the case. I think everyone expected this kind of stuff to be included, and I haven't heard from anybody who has any concerns about these particular changes.
Thank you, Mayor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking on this only because we have 10 minutes between now and the next public participation meeting time, and also because I think it's an excellent opportunity to put an exclamation mark behind what Councillor Helmer has just spoken about. This is going to be phenomenal for London. It is, without any exaggeration, one of a kind. It's the largest indoor ropes course and zip line course in North America, possibly the world, and they're doing the research on that right now as one small component of this just incredible entertainment site that is going to draw people from across London. There's no question about that, but really from across southwestern Ontario and beyond. When I think about how I felt personally when I heard that the Kellogg plant was closing and that we were losing that legacy employer and that legacy in our community, I felt for the families, certainly, who were affected. And I also wondered, what in the world can we do with that building, with the massive amount of square footage that it has, the industrial purpose that it's been set up for. And when you walk into that huge room that's connected to all of the ovens multi-stories up, and you look at what they've done with it, it's remarkable. I have to say that I think the only other use could have been a set for a Star Wars movie or something like that. That could be used once in a while, but it's incredible. I can't wait to learn more about the grand opening, to see and then to see what it's going to do for certainly Ward 4 and what it's going to do for all of London.
8 minutes to spare. Yeah. Any further comments? Mr. Fleming.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to thank my colleagues over in Development Services who knocked themselves out to get this to committee as quickly as possible. I know all of them, but in particular Heather and I think Lou Pompili, the two of them together worked very hard to get this here really quickly.
Wonderful, thank you. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say, I know that when we consider the last item on the agenda, the Dundas Oldies Village corridor, and how it comes right up to Kellogg Lane, so like that stops just before this area, and then there's the Kellogg's building. So I think like as we always say, really, really cool things happening in Old East, and it really says a lot about the community there. I know I've said this before, because I know you, through you, Mr. Chair, have been the driving force for a lot of the good things that are going on, and kudos to our staff as well, who really having a lot of vision for the area and sharing the vision with the community. So I don't think I can stretch that out anymore, but congratulations and great job to the community for this and to staff as well.
Thank you. I would look to the committee for a motion. Moved by Mayor Brown. Put it to Councillor Helmer and seconded by Mayor Brown. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you, and I'd look to the committee for another recess for 6 minutes. Take us to 5:30. Moved by Mayor Brown, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. All in favor? Just for the people in the gallery, we have timed items on the agenda, and statutorily we are not to proceed with them until that time, so that's why we take these little breaks. This is a picture of government efficiency. We're moving ahead of schedule.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone back to the next item, which is a delegation request from Dr. Mackey from the Middlesex London Health Unit. And I understand that this is a delegation request, and I know there's a number of members from the public here. So I would like to go to staff and talk about the process moving forward for the public engagement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's important to raise a couple of, just to inform the public, anybody that's watching, people that are in the gallery about this, just what we're talking about today. And before, through you, it turns over to Dr. Mackey. The first point is that the City Council is not the body that makes decisions on supervised consumption facilities. And I think that's important to understand. So Dr. Mackey's asked for delegation status today to talk about some of the plans that he's involved with, together with potential operator of a facility like this. But I think everyone that's watching should recognize that this is not something that, as a permission for a supervised consumption facility, is something that is not something that council provides. It's something that the federal government provides, and you'd remember that from the presentation that I gave previously on this subject. Council does, though, have a council policy that they've approved, and that council policy does have a number of criteria that they've asked any potential operator to consider when locating a supervised consumption facility. And there's also in that council policy some process requests. So those are things, while council doesn't have a legislative authority relating to those things at this time, they do have a council policy that's standing. And I think that in my work with Dr. Mackey, is we've been discussing potential locations, he's certainly always been very respectful of that council policy. And I don't want to speak for him in any way, but I think that's a big part of why he's here today. Now, if there are any requirements for zoning amendments relating to these locations, there would be a public process, and that would be a municipal process relating to a zoning amendment. And I think that that's something that you, Madam Chair, wanted me to make sure I mentioned, because that's the process that people would be more familiar with, is where somebody wants to change the zoning on the site in order to allow a use. If the zoning on the site allows for a facility such as this, and I think our zoning folks have said that it would come under the definition of a clinic. So if there's a site that already allows for that use, there would be no zoning amendment requirement, and then it would just be meeting the requirements of either site plan, if that applies in that case, or if site plan doesn't apply, then it would be building code. Mr. Kostas would deal with those things. So in terms of process, it really depends on the sites. It depends on what zoning's in place. But Dr. Mackey is here to make a delegation and engaging with you on that basis. And perhaps afterwards, so that these are the introductory comments he asked me to make, but afterwards, glad to speak to any questions that the committee might have relating to the planning elements of this or the council policy that we brought forward previously.
Thank you for that, Mr. Fleming. I think it is important that we try to understand this very unique process that we are here to discuss. So committee, I'd like to ask Dr. Mackey to come up and introduce yourself, and just to let you know, there is 5 minutes for your delegation, and I'll leave that with you.
Great, 5 minutes. Wow, I will move quickly then. Do you have my presentation up on your screen? Yes, super. So the question about whether supervised consumption works, it's already working here, and I'm happy to share with you some of the results from our temporary overdose prevention site. You will recall that we started operating there February 12th at 186 King. These are some pictures of the site. You can see it's a very clean, clinical, professional looking environment. and it's very well run. As of last Wednesday, we had 2,099 client visits at the site, almost 700 unique clients. 3 overdoses, all were handled very smoothly. Hundreds of clients connecting with other services, including drug counseling and treatment services. No increase in neighborhood issues, crime, loitering, anything like that. Several different neighbors noting a reduction in needle waste around the site. Innovation Works has noticed this, the Covent Garden Market noticed this, and some of the staff that work in White 86 King. So what about the neighborhood? What are the impacts potentially on a neighborhood of a supervised consumption? You will have seen a story last week where one of our local reporters interviewed the woman who started the first ever supervised consumption site in a residential building in Canada. The question asked was, do supervised consumption sites increase crime? And the answer was no. Some really compelling stories about how the culture of that building was changed for the better with the launch of supervised consumption. This matches well with the research evidence that shows that there is no drug-related increase in crime in a neighborhood where supervised consumption is initiated. And in addition, there are reductions in public disorder, or if you prefer avoiding double negatives, increases in public order in those types of facilities. And that's been shown on a couple of different research studies as well. Our property values affected. This is the trend over the last 10 years, Vancouver Downtown East Side property prices. You can see that over the last year, prices in the Downtown East Side have gone up about 25%, and over the last 10 years, it's 120%. How does that compare with the rest of downtown neighborhoods? This slide shows you downtown neighborhoods, the 6 major neighborhoods in downtown. And as you can see, Cold Harbor, Yaletown, False Creek have all increased in value about 70% over that time. Downtown West and the West End, more like 90%. The Downtown East Side, where this Canada's first supervised injection site is, property values have gone up over 110%, almost 120%, far outpacing the other downtown Vancouver neighborhoods. We've had some public meetings over the last little while about the 2 sites proposed, which you see in your report, 446 York and 241 Simcoe. I'll give you the high-level themes in the interest of time. Personal safety comes up as the #1 issue of anyone who's living, working in the area, but also the #1 issue of anyone using the facility. We are all interested in personal safety. Security of property has come up as well, property values, which I've talked about, and then trust, making sure that there is a strong relationship between the people in the area and the people providing service in the area, the institutions. Lots of people suggesting that this sort of facility be opened up in other areas, maybe industrial areas or the periphery of the city. We know that won't work in terms of clients accessing it. But there was a very productive recommendation that came up on Thursday evening, and that was around neighborhood safety planning. Again, everyone being interested in personal safety. Let's get the police, the agencies, neighbors, businesses all together talking about what are the resources that we have, how can we use them to maximize safety in the neighborhood. In particular, in each of these sites, we have proposed a significant investment in security guards for the sites and the areas around there. So we believe that adding that 24/7 security will substantially improve security in the neighborhoods that we're going into. Just some some specific surveying of people at 241 Simcoe. We had a very heated building meeting last Friday, and then LMHC followed up with some questions around can people see the benefits of a supervised consumption facility. Over 50% of the people who live at 241 Simcoe in the LMHC building believe that they could. What benefits did they see? Enhanced security being #1, less drug trafficking, and more site services on site also being important. For people that didn't see a benefit, their biggest concern was safety. Again, we've done many things to design the service to address safety. And then aside from supervised consumption facilities, what's the biggest concern of people living in 241 Simcoe? And it is, again, security or safety. I have the floor layouts, but I think I'll just put them up and pass over them. And
Just before you go forward, Dr. Mackey, I do apologize for interrupting, but I do want to go to the committee 5 minutes. I'm looking for an extension. Motion by Mayor Brown, seconded by Councillor Helmer, and if you could proceed.
Madam Chair, I will scarcely need that. This is my final slide. What you have in front of you.
Sorry,
is-
Dr. Mackey, if I can interrupt again, I'm
Oh,
new to this job. If I can
You need a vote.
have a vote? You now can proceed.
Super. So you've got two data sets overlaid here, and I was going to put a third on, but I'll just talk through it because it'll get really messy if I do. The blue is a heat map, so the darker the blue, the more needles have been reported through the London Cares Needle Collection Service. The dots, yellow, green, and red, and blue, there's one blue dot, these are the recommended locations where, when we did the public survey of 2,500 people, these are the places that people recommended placing a supervised consumption facility. The red dots are actually exactly where we are proposing the mobile facility go in. So the mobile facility, which we've also applied for separately, will visit Dundas and Richmond, Dundas and Adelaide, and Horton and Wellington. It won't be right on those middle of those busy intersections. It'll be within, a block or so of those intersections, and we will be discussing with residents and business owners in the area to make sure that within that area we could find the best possible place to stop a small, discreet van that no one will probably really notice unless they know what it's for. The other thing that I'll point out is just near this bottom red, there's a dot right at 241 Simcoe. So somebody, 1 to 4 people actually recommended that exact location. But again, it's very accessible from downtown and from the Wellington and Horton area. And then over here, we have the 2 green dots and a couple of yellow dots as well. This is the 446 York area. So again, an area that is both accessible to the major downtown regions where this issue is prevalent, and also was recognized by participants in the survey. So I will leave it there and look forward to any questions you may have, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to go to the committee then for any questions. Councillor Park?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got one question for Dr. Mackey and then one for Mr. Fleming. So today, for the purposes of the application for the Middlesex London Health Unit, what does endorsement from council mean? Is it a requirement of the application process? Can you just impart some wisdom on that?
Certainly, through you, Madam Chair, this is a really important endorsement for a couple of reasons. In terms of the application, while City Council approval isn't a formal requirement under the application, we know that the needs and the expressed opinion of the community are considered very closely when the provincial government and the federal government are making their approval. So we believe that they're watching closely what happens at City Council. We haven't received approval yet, obviously, or you know about it, but we have submitted all documents that have been requested. We're just waiting that approval. So we think an endorsement would be really important here for that reason. But the second reason is that we've also, we have lost 400 lives to the opioid crisis over the last decade. That has really affected people in the community. A lot of people who have lost, their children through this crisis. And we think that it'll be really important for them to hear that City Council recognizes the value of those lives lost and wants to be part of the solution. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Through the chair to Mr. Fleming, thank you for the introduction earlier, because I think that set a really good tone for the discussions today, and it really gave a lot of information that's very needed. I wonder if you can talk about, from a planning perspective, what the federal exemption does in terms of what zoning happens. So recognizing that right now 186 King Street is not zoned for the use that's happening there. Can we talk about that role and that dynamic?
Madam Chair, certainly, if I could, I'd like to answer Councillor Park's question, but before I do, I'd just like to clarify something that I said at the outset, and it relates to that role of council. I want to be clear that what I was talking about is the role relative to the approval of supervised consumption facility as it relates to that exemption from federal law. There may be, if, for example, the LMHC properties, there might be a role of council from that perspective. I'm not clear on that at this point, but I just wanted to not overreach with my comment around council's role. But with respect to zoning, I would emphasize that, and Mr. Kotzef is beside me here, what the federal exemption does is in fact gives that exemption which allows for the consumption of what would otherwise be illegal drugs on the premises. So that is the extent of the exemption. The use still has to comply with all other requirements, municipal requirements, including zoning. So I certainly stand to be corrected. I think Dr. Mackey has a lot more detail than I do on some of those approvals that are required, but certainly from a zoning perspective, conformity with zoning is required. And as I said, if the current zoning under clinic, if that use is not permitted on the site, it simply means that there will be a process required, and that process would be our traditional zoning amendment process, and the public would be invited into that process the same way that they are for any other zoning amendment process.
Councillor Park?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate all of that information. Recognizing that we're at Planning Committee and everything that we do has to be in compliance with the Planning Act, I've got a motion that I would like to move. And it says that the following actions be taken with respect to supervised consumption facility locations. A, the provision of supervised consumption facilities in London be endorsed. B, civic administration be directed to consult with the London Police Services, Middlesex London Health Unit, Regional HIV/AIDS Connection, London and Middlesex Housing Corporation, resident and business associations of the areas being considered for proposed supervised consumption sites with respect to the preparation of a neighborhood safety plan. C, civic administration be directed to consult with London and Middlesex Housing Corporation to work on any required changes. So if the Housing Corporation wants to offer the service, there may be potential, house the service. There may be potential changes to the Articles of Incorporation and those sorts of things. So if that is the direction, I think that those conversations should be had, and Councillor Hopkins and I discussed the importance of that earlier. That D, the delegation from Dr. Mackey, from the Middlesex London Health Unit and communications received at the April 30th meeting of the Planning and Environment Committee be referred to a future meeting of the Planning and Environment Committee for consideration in conjunction with the staff report with respect to the necessary amendments to the official plan and zoning bylaw to supervise consumption facilities and temporary overdose prevention sites. So the idea behind this motion is that if council endorses a use before a zoning bylaw amendment application is received or a public participation meeting is had, I worry that we are not in compliance with the Planning Act. So I think that it's important that, as Dr. Mackey said, that council makes a statement that we are endorsing the use of supervised consumption facilities in London. And I think that that's an important statement to be made. So I move that.
So we have a motion here by Councillor Park, and I guess if we can see it. And I have a seconder, Matt.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all. I just would like to hear Dr. Mackey's comments on this motion, so I can get a sense of whether that goes far enough. I know that we're all working hard to give you what you need to move this forward, and I think if you could speak to that, that would be helpful.
Thank you. Through the chair, I think there's a lot of good in this motion, and I think the neighborhood safety planning and the work to make sure that LMHC is well prepared to host would be much appreciated. We certainly would support those directions. I'm concerned about what a deferral would do at this point. I'm not sure how that would be interpreted by the Minister of Health provincially, where this decision currently sits from the perspective of the application process for the federal exemption. We need Minister of Health provincial sign-off. That's our next step. And, you know, I think in terms of the message to community, that you are more experienced than I am there, but I am concerned about what a deferral would do. The other thing that it would potentially do is slow down any of the, you know, finalizing of leases and initiation of work to prepare those sites. If we can't get their work underway quickly, it just puts the implementation off that much longer, and I would be concerned about what would happen in terms of, in the meantime, we're not serving people that we should be serving. Thanks.
Point of clarification, Councillor Parr?
Yeah, thank you. Just to clarify this before it goes any further, there is no deferral suggested here by any means. It was an endorsement of supervised consumption sites in the City of London. Wherever those sites are, the municipal council can vote to endorse those without going forward with zoning bylaw changes at this time.
Okay.
So
Mayor
just
Brown.
a follow-up question, if I could, Chair, to Dr. Mackey. So knowing that information, that this would be an endorsement from City Council, a blanket endorsement, really, for supervised consumption sites to be located within the city, also recognizing that you have the authority to move this forward on your own, how does that balance out? Or do you want endorsement of specific addresses?
Through the chair, it's been a difficult process to get where we are. I'm concerned about putting up further barriers, and I think that you know, this committee has been very involved in the process up to this stage, and as the partners representing the partners in the application process, we've done everything that we think is possible to ensure that City Council has the appropriate information to make this sort of decision. I am concerned about what a deferral on these locations would mean. We really believe that we need to move forward urgently, and that if there isn't a decision this evening, it'll impact the process.
Okay, thank you. So obviously this is an incredibly serious situation, and one that the committee is taking to heart. I'm going to provide some comments based on just context, and I think that we all need to recognize that this is a crisis that's occurring right across Canada. And we saw it emerge first on the West Coast, and it's slowly working its way across the country, province by province by province. And it is a serious crisis. People are dying. As you pointed out in your presentation, 400 people have lost their lives over the past 10 years in our community. We should expect that number to go up, unfortunately, as this crisis grows. Certainly, we were able to show leadership as a community when we opened the temporary overdose prevention site, the first one in Ontario. And there was community apprehension and there was criticism that was being balanced out with an emergency situation. And we reacted quickly, the province reacted quickly, and put into place the first site. We've seen how it's gone. And this was really important, that this work. We see no increase in crime, a reduction in the number of needles that are being located, no overall negative effect to the neighborhood, but a very positive effect in the fact that over 700 people, individuals, have used this site, and at least 3 lives have potentially been saved to date. And so one of the things that I certainly learned when I visited the east side of Vancouver, Vancouver's downtown, is that this works. And I met with community leaders, I met with people who operated businesses, I met with people from the social services industry, and each and every one of them told me that the neighborhood was better because of the supervised consumption site. And I think we have to take that to heart. That's lived experience. The other thing that I've learned through this process over the past year, and I think the entire community needs to consider this as well, is that in Ontario, things like hepatitis C, HIV are on the decline. In London, they're on the rise. They're on the increase. So again, people might be dying quickly from something like a fentanyl poisoning overdose, or they might be dying slowly from something like HIV or hepatitis C, or something else I've learned about over the past year, endocarditis, a serious infection of the blood that creates weeks and weeks and weeks of treatment in hospital. All of these things, from a compassionate perspective, indicate that people are suffering, and even from a resource management perspective, that if we can introduce a harm reduction strategy, then we can redirect our resources elsewhere. The last thing I want to talk about through my experience over the past year is that part of the overall strategy to introduce this requires a lot of science, and it requires a lot of study, and it requires medical knowledge, but it also requires love. And as a community, we have committed to build a better city for all. And that means every single one of our citizens needs to have the kinds of treatments available to them that we're able to provide compassion and to provide life-saving strategies. And so I'd like this motion, if there is a seconder, to be called in sections. And if the portion that refers the decision of endorsement fails, I'd like to bring forward a motion that endorses this in principle, recognizing that there is a process that needs to take place, recognizing that this first part of the process is outside of our jurisdiction, but that would communicate very clearly to the province and to the federal government that this council believes this needs to happen sooner rather than later.
Thank you for those comments. So I would like to go to staff, if I may, just to get a bit of more information.
Madam Chair, I'll begin and then certainly defer to Mr. Kosofis on this, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to the zoning. And I'm not quite clear if council's wanting to endorse uses that are contrary to the existing zoning, but again, I want to be very clear that uses are not permitted if they don't conform with zoning. And the only way to change that is to amend the zoning, either to allow for the use explicitly or across all zones in the city, for example. So again, I just want to be clear that there isn't the ability of council today to say these uses can be allowed anywhere in the city from a technical zoning perspective.
Thank you for that. Then I'll go to Councillor Park.
Thank you. I just want to be very clear about A. There was never any intention of creating a barrier. It was more to remove one. We've already seen a situation where one property owner pulled out of an agreement. And at that point, Dr. Mackey had to come back before committee and council. If that happens again, I think it would be important to have a blanket endorsement. So this isn't a thing that has to happen again, that the community consultations can happen, and it doesn't have to come before here, because time is of the essence here, sincerely. And our timelines for committee and council meetings draw out that timeline. So I'm a proponent that those sites have to be exactly where they need to be. They have to be in close proximity to the individuals who need those services, because they desperately need them. I think that there's areas in the city, and perhaps these properties are those areas. And, you know, I was meeting with a property owner on York Street last week, and we're sitting in the office, and right before our eyes, leaned up against the fence at the school, there's an individual injecting. These issues are serious, they're substantial, they're on our streets, they're in our alleyways, they're in our hallways of apartment buildings, they're in our own living rooms and basements. And it's a serious issue that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed expeditiously. So again, my intention behind this was not to create a barrier, but to give free passage, to move forward so that we can have more sites operationalized in the City of London to curb this crisis, because we absolutely need to do that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. So I do have some questions for Dr. Mackey. I wonder if I can just go through those. So I think on the slide, you were measuring from the start of the temporary overdose prevention site to last week, was it? So 9 weeks that it's been operating, is that the right time frame?
That's right, through you, Madam Chair, that would have been till last Wednesday, so 2.5 months.
So I think it's helpful to keep that in mind because we're looking at something like 700 unique people using the service over a 2.5 month period, which on the one hand is a lot of people. And I think it might surprise people that there's that many people in the City of London who want to use a service like this. But I think it's been very steady. And on average, if we're looking over the course of time there, that's about 40, 45 people a day who are using the service. So that's if you take all the 2,100 visits and just divide them out over the amount of time it's been open. So, you know, this is a service that's open right now, I think at 9 to 5. As it turns out, that's a timing that a lot of the people accessing the service would prefer. And so that's the hours that it's been set at. And I guess my question for Dr. Mackey is, so this is the temporary overdose prevention site, which is obviously in constrained sort of physical facilities. Once you have 2 supervised consumption facilities open, operating on an ongoing basis, and then also a mobile service, what do you expect the volume of people accessing the services at these different locations to be?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. So I should add that we actually broke a record today. We had 59 people through the temporary overdose prevention site today, and that's more than we've had any other day. And yet, we estimate that there are something in the range of 5,000 injections in London and Middlesex every day. So even that 59 is just over 1% of the total issue. In areas where this sort of facility has been operating for some time, it's in the range of 20% of people that use the facility. So 20% of people using IV drugs in downtown East Side, for example, access the supervised consumption facility. And even for that 20%, they don't access it for the majority of their injections. So it really is a place where educating people about safe injection practices is important, connecting people with other services is important, and it's a major component of outreach to the people that are the highest risk, that have nowhere else to go, that are injecting in back alleys, doorwells, stairwells. So from that perspective, the community benefit is strong, but we recognize that that sort of service is not reaching everybody. We need lots of other strategies to reach everyone as well. 700 is, just over 10% of the estimated 5,000 or 6,000 people who are using IV drugs in our community. We definitely want to get that up. We want to get that to the industry standard of around 20%. And the combination of locations that we proposed with mobile and fixed site, we believe is a really strong combination. Incidentally, I should mention, I live within 3 or 4 blocks of 2 of the proposed sites. So, I find needles in my front yard. And so I want this somewhere close that can help improve my neighborhood as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer?
Okay, so if we had, let's say, there's increased uptake and you get somewhere around like 120 people accessing the service, regularly, and there's multiple locations, and it's open 8 hours a day. I just want to be clear with everyone that we're talking about, maybe 10 or 20 people coming in an hour or something. You're going to work through, this is the kind of volume of the service. And we're talking about it sort of from a land use planning perspective, right? And so I think it's important to keep in mind, like, what kind of building would support that kind of visitation? What kind of facility? Where does it need to be located? What kind of access do people need to have to it? Those are the kind of things we're talking about here, right? Which is the land use planning aspects. And I think that the council policy we passed, I know that it was in advance of actually dealing with the official plan and zoning amendments was a helpful guide in terms of evaluating from a land use perspective, what kind of locations are better than others in terms of avoiding conflicts with other kind of land uses, because I don't think there's any disagreement about the need for supervised consumption services. The question is, what kind of locations would be best for those services to be provided in, not just in a negative way of trying to avoid conflicts with other things, but in a positive way, which is to say, where should they be located so that they're most useful for people in the community who need access to the services. So as Dr. Mackey said, for example, people will suggest put them in an industrial area. Well, I can tell you access out to industrial areas via transit, for example, proves to be a continual challenge for the Transit Commission. And that's not a great idea, because we're not going to have a lot of people who are otherwise injecting in public, driving their car, for example, to industrial location. That's just not going to happen. It needs to be easily reachable by foot and by transit. I think that the 446 York Street location is a pretty good location. I've heard from a lot of clients and business owners right around that area just in the last couple of days, all expressing essentially the same kind of concerns by email, which is a lot of fear about what it will mean for their business. And I think it's very understandable that that is the reaction when a site is suggested. Part of the reason that that kind of reaction is because there are existing problems in the area and people are worried that they're going to get worse. Part of the reaction is that there's a stigma associated with drug use, and that stigma affects both people's perception of the service and also their perception of how things will be changing in the future. So we really need to work against that stigma. The stigma itself is one of the reasons why people are having such health harms, because they're not able to access services, even regular health services. They have difficulty accessing those things. They have difficulty adhering to treatment because they're stigmatized. It's hard to find them and get them connected into care. And this is one of the key aspects of supervised consumption, is providing them with a point of contact that they need to come to, that they want to come to, and that will allow them a doorway into many other services that they need. So I think that there will be pros and cons to any location we are going to be dealing with. And I think 446 York is a pretty good one. I think it's a pretty good one. 241 Simcoe is obviously a bit different. It's in some ways very similar to what we have with the temporary overdose prevention site, which is we have the idea is to do it, I think, on the ground floor or lower level, and then residential on top of that. And that's the situation in the current temporary overdose prevention site. Seems to be working fairly well. And so I think it can be done well. But it also involves, transformation of that building, conceivably there'd be some loss of housing units. So it's not as though it's just a really straightforward, obvious thing to do. I think tenants in the building, I wasn't at the public meeting, but as it was described as kind of tense, I could see why that would be the case. They have existing problems with injection drug use in the building. They're worried, is it going to get worse? How is this going to affect me? But at the same time, I think they would recognize, just like anybody else who's observing these behaviors, that people really need the service. So I think it can be a very difficult issue for people who are living in the building. I think based on what I know so far, that kind of location could also work. I think if you have a supportive landlord, somebody who's willing to work with it, and a good approach to how the service is actually going to be delivered, I think that could be really helpful. I think the ideas of including 24/7 security, as long as it's done in an effective way that involves de-escalation rather than like confronting people, I think that could be really positive for the building and for the area as well. Those are some of my comments just off the top. I don't have any problem endorsing both of those locations at this point. I do agree with Councillor Park in some ways that just endorsing the service provision is a good idea, but I do think there are some locations that would not be very well suited for the provision. I'm not sure that planning committee really needs to be the one who is reviewing that. The health unit and the regional HIV/AIDS connection, I think they know better in terms of where the locations that would work and would not work are, and I expect they were not going to bring us very many that are going to be really bad. So I'm not sure I want to just blanket endorse, put them wherever you want. But I do think that these two specific locations are good choices. I also support in general the concept of the mobile service. And I think we have to find locations for that with parking the van so that it is discreet. You know, I think that's one of the things you hear from the research. You know, people don't want to be in sight of the police station. They don't want to make it really obvious where it is that they're going. They want to be able to use the service in a kind of anonymous way where they're not really being identified as a person who's injecting drugs. And I think we have to plan that out so we find a location where that can happen and not be sort of parading people along the street to say, go check out this van. You know, that's what you're looking for. So I'm sure we can do that. You know, I think a lot of really smart people are working on this project trying to make it happen. So I would be willing to support the two specific facilities that have been suggested, those particular addresses. I recognize we're not doing the zoning right now, and that's not what we're discussing. We're really just endorsing the locations in principle. The health unit has got to work through the process of getting those things approved, and we've got to deal with the zoning process on the policy side ourselves. The last thing I'll ask for our staff through the chair to Mr. Fleming is just how the public use provisions in the zoning bylaw interact, because, you know, the health unit is a provincially funded and municipally funded municipal local board. You know, the City of London can put facilities in all kinds of places without having zoning amendments. So can the province of Ontario. And I wonder, you know, if we're talking about what's really allowed under zoning, considering the health unit is one of the proponents, how the public use piece interacts with that.
Through the chair, there's specific requirements that set out public use, and then the bylaw further explains public uses. Need to satisfy both. It is questionable depending on who the actual applicant and the operator is. So at this point in time, I couldn't tell you. I think we'd have to have further discussion to see how it actually is playing through, whether or not that provision could apply.
Thank you for that. I'd like to go to Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question through you to Dr. Mackey. It's a really long process of applying for this federal exemption, and that's why we have the temporary overdose prevention site. So I'm wondering if this is where we are in the process, is to move for you to move it along. Do you need to provide these addresses to the other levels of government?
Yes, through the chair, these addresses are part of our formal application. So they've certainly gone in. What we're looking at now is, you know, can we move the local process, the zoning, the council support forward in parallel to the provincial process?
Thank you. So to planning staff, I'm not sure if you have the report in front of you from Dr. Mackey, his number 2 is problematic. And I wonder what your opinion is on his number 2, if that's even something that we can do. As Councillor Park, you know, she stated pretty clearly her reservations about number 2 and whether we would be not in compliance with the Planning Act.
Well, Madam Chair, I think that in order for a zoning amendment to take place, if the current zoning doesn't allow for it, and I think that's a key piece, in order for a zoning amendment to take place, there needs to be appropriate notice given under the Planning Act, and that be understood and an opportunity for the public to interact with that, and then council, having clearly satisfied the requirements of the Act, then making the decision. So we are intending to come to committee, and excuse me for just one moment, I'll just check in with Mr. Barrett. Is it May or June? We're looking to come forward in May. We still need to get to the senior management team just to take things through and see if there's any big picture perspective concerns, so that they could be pushed back, but I believe it's on the agenda for the 14th. So At that time, there could be a referral back to us from a number of different perspectives, and things that I've heard tonight might weigh in. So for example, no, we don't want to go forward with these policies that you're recommending. We want broader acceptance of where these facilities are permitted, or come back with an amendment specific to the location that, or the locations that are being proposed by the health unit, so that these ones aren't affected, or at least it'd be subject to a city initiated amendment. So I guess what I'm saying is we can bring forward at that time some options for the committee to consider. But we do need to go through the appropriate process in order for the zoning to allow for the use, and that process needs to comply with the Planning Act.
Thank you for that. And so at the May 14th meeting, could we possibly be looking at rezoning these two sites at that meeting, or?
So no, because we haven't got notice. If these sites complied with the zoning bylaw, so in other words, the current zoning, if the current zoning allowed for these uses, and I don't think that they currently do, but if they did, then what you could do is withhold 3 readings of the new bylaw until such time as these move forward. But that would be if the clinic use already applied to the zoning on the lands. If they don't already, then we're best to get some direction from you to move forward with a zoning amendment, or for Dr. Mackey to come forward with his own zoning amendment to get that process rolling as soon as possible.
Thank you for that. So Councillor Helmer spoke about the public use, and I just want a little bit of clarification on that. If it falls under that, does that mean these two sites would not need a zoning amendment?
Through the chair, well, public use is permitted in all zones, so I think there's some specific criteria and tests that would have to be realized before that could even be applied to this use.
Thank you. And you mentioned the operator would be one of the criteria. So I believe it's Regional HIV and AIDS Connection that would be the operator. I don't know if you could speak to that specifically, Mr. Kotsivas.
Through you, Madam Chair, maybe just clarify. Right now, the application to the federal government is under Regional HIV/AIDS Connection and the Middlesex London Health Unit. It looks at this point like Regional HIV/AIDS Connection would be the primary operator. I wouldn't say that's set in stone, but I would also point out that RHAC is an AIDS service organization. It's a provincially funded public institution.
Okay, thank you. So I'm anxious to get this moving and have as few hiccups as possible, realizing the bumpy road that we've taken so far. I believe we've already provided an overall endorsement of supervised consumption facilities in London with past work that's been done at committee. I had a ward meeting last Thursday, and as I've done for the last couple of ward meetings, I wanted to provide my constituents with an update on what's going on around this whole file. So I had Mr. Barrett there to speak from the city planning perspective around supervised consumption facilities and temporary overdose prevention sites. And I also had Sonia Burke from Regional HIV/AIDS Connection. People are aware in this city what's going on. As I said, this is the second time I've had this kind of update at my ward meeting, and I had almost 100 people there on Thursday night. So it was, I'm in the Masonville area, I'm in suburbia, I'm in an area where people feel sort of sheltered from this kind of thing. But it was useful for them to see that this is happening across London, not just in the hot spots. And I know Ms. Burke made a really poignant point when she said people are coming to the temporary overdose prevention site before work and on their lunch breaks. So it's not just the really, really marginalized people in our city that are using this service. She also made some really good points about the cost to treat one single person with the 4 major health issues that we're dealing with in London as a result of the injection and opioid crisis. So the cost to treat a person with HIV or AIDS for a year, the cost to treat someone with endocarditis, hepatitis C, and the strep flesh-eating disease. And it was millions and millions of dollars. And relative to the cost to operate these facilities, it's a no-brainer for the cost to society. It's a no-brainer that this particular pillar of the strategy to deal with this crisis is a really important pillar, the harm reduction one. So as I said, I'm fully willing to go forward with these 2 addresses. I'm not sure about the rest of the motion. I have to mull it over because I'm wondering if number B, one more question through you, Madam Chair. I know Middlesex London Health Unit has done a vast amount of consultation on this. Would this be seen through you to Dr. Mackey as any kind of overlap? I'm not sure how heavily involved London City staff have been in this consultation so far.
Dr. Mackey?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair, I actually think that the direction to initiate neighborhood safety planning is actually quite helpful in that it brings into the picture several organizations where council has ability to direct the organizations. And I think people will be really excited when they see the resources that are coming to the table. There aren't many neighborhoods that have any service that has a 24/7 security guard, right? So if you're looking at neighborhood safety, but of course we don't want to just offer security within the 4 walls of the facility that we're operating. We want to know how that resource can be used for the immediate neighbors and for the community. And how do we get connection between the formal security services, whether they're the private security that we're talking about or the police service, and the neighborhoods, so that we have, the best intelligence of what's happening. We know where issues are and we know where people should be deployed. I find that, I think that'll be a really exciting conversation.
Thank you for that. Mayor Brown.
So I think we've had good debate, and I think we're working towards some kind of convergence. So I'm going to make a suggestion as sort of maybe step 1 here of moving forward with the motion. And I'll note that the motion before us and that's on screen does not have a seconder. And we're also at committee, so we can make changes as we go. What I'd like to suggest to the committee, and I'll make this as a motion to see if there's a seconder, that Part A of what you see on the screen be replaced with Part 1 of Dr. Mackey's recommendation. And that would read basically an endorsement of both the 241 Simcoe Street and the 44 York Street as appropriate locations for permanent supervised consumption facilities. Keep Part B that you see on the screen, and again, that's directing the Civic Administration to consult with the London Police Service, Middlesex London Health Unit, Regional HIV/AIDS Connection, London Middlesex Housing Corporation, residents and business associations of an area, of the areas being considered for proposed supervised consumption site with respect to a neighborhood safety plan. And then also, I think to move things along, Part C, leave that as it's worded on the screen as well, which talks about the Civic Administration being directed to consult with LMHC to work on any required changes to the Articles of Incorporation and Shareholders Agreement if there are changes that are needed. So I think I'd like to put those 3 things on the table and look for a seconder.
Councillor Cassidy is seconding.
And I'd also, if I could, while I have the floor, ask Dr. Mackey to comment on those 3 elements of the motion and whether that helps us move in the direction that we need to in an urgent way.
Through you, Madam Chair, the formal endorsement of the locations is really helpful, and I think the other 2 components of that motion would complement that well.
Councillor Helmer.
So I think I'm in support of what the mayor is suggesting, but I also think that this first Part A from Councillor Park, which he suggested, is also helpful with with maybe a small revision. So there's the supervised consumption facilities. I think we should probably say supervised consumption services because we're, for one thing, looking at a mobile service. And then I think if we say endorsed in principle, I think that's helpful because we haven't actually done that at council. We endorsed the work of the working group, the opioid crisis working group. We've talked about it, but we haven't actually endorsed the idea that this kind of service should be provided in the City of London. And I think that that is an important step. Aside from the specific locations that we're also talking about, I think just generally saying we support the provision of supervised consumption services in London, I think that's an important message. So if it was that and not the piece around the two specific locations, I still think it would be good, but it wouldn't be helping in terms of giving some advice around the location specifically. And I think that we should do both. So if we could perhaps just leave the A and then just add B, C, D, E, and just renumber everything accordingly. Because I think that one from Councillor Park is very good.
I'd see that as a friendly amendment.
Okay, so we've got a friendly amendment on that. And I wonder if the committee will allow me just to ask a few questions here. So we've got the amendment. I'll speak to the amendment first then. And I do have a question to staff about, by committing the two sites, endorsing the two sites, how does that change the zoning process, or does it change it?
Madam Chair, I think it's really important that you don't prejudice the zoning amendment application process, and that this discussion and this resolution that you're considering, or this motion that you're considering, isn't perceived to be related to the zoning amendment, but rather is relating to council's response to the delegation that's been made and even the council policy that council has, but nothing under the Planning Act. And obviously with that, I'm saying that the zoning amendment would stand alone and there needs to be the due process relating to the Planning Act for that to take place. And that, just to be clear, that's for everybody's benefit because you don't want to be offside relating to a planning application, which then opens up opportunities for appeal, et cetera.
Thank you for that. I think that's very important for us to understand as a committee, the process moving forward and what we're doing here tonight. The other question I have tonight, can we basically refer this request from Dr. Mackey back to staff to make sure that these two sites do meet the criteria of the safe injection site? And would that report come back? And I'm just trying to understand the timing now. So we have May 14th, the timing of the zoning change and the OP change coming forward. Would that give staff enough information or enough time to make sure, if we do support these sites, that we could refer it back, making sure the sites meet the criteria, and then have that discussion about the zoning changes, May 14th?
Well, Madam Chair, we provided our opinion to Dr. Mackey on two previous sites, and we could provide something like that to you. However, I think we need some clarity because from what I've heard so far, I think what I've heard the committee say, and perhaps I'm wrong, is, well, maybe I'll put it this way. The committee could just go forward and say, relative to the policy, we're not talking about Planning Act stuff, but relative to the policy, they're okay with the two sites. If that's the direction they go, then that's one direction. If you want to go the other direction, that would be, or another direction, that would be the one that you're referring to, and that would be asking for staff to give you some opinions so you can make a decision at that time. But I would see those as two different ways of approaching it as opposed to doing both of those.
Okay, thank you for that. The other question I have as it relates to the London Middlesex housing site, and I wonder if I could go to staff to speak to I guess, the C portion, and if I could get staff's comment.
Thank you. I'll field this one through the chair. I'll start my comment by indicating that I would caution council about endorsing any site in this forum, given that this is the planning committee, and notwithstanding what Mr. Fleming has said about trying to separate decisions under the Planning Act and decisions related to the federal regulation of safe injection sites. It may be perceived that decisions made by this committee are in fact decisions being made with respect to planning matters. So you've got to be very careful the tightrope that you appear to be walking on with respect to the first portion of the, as I understand, the motion that's on the floor now. A motion that was originally on the floor, Part A, which supported safe injection locations within the City of London, absent any site-specific endorsements, is not, in my view, offensive. But when you start to look at specific sites outside of the planning process, I get nervous. And I'm not even trying to go in camera, so you know how nervous I am. I want the committee to hear this without hiding behind an in-camera session. So having expressed my concern about specific sites, it becomes apparent that Part C of this resolution, in my view, is also not appropriate because it's talking about the London Middlesex Housing Corp. So it's relatively easy to determine that we might be talking about one of their specific sites. And in my view, that again might tend to cloud the issue about, is this a planning approval or not a planning approval? And if the London Middlesex Housing Corp wants to participate, then in my view, it's incumbent on them to come to council to make the necessary requests with respect to the shareholder declaration and any amendments that might be required to their articles of incorporation.
Okay, thank you for that. And if I could just remind the public to keep your enthusiasm quietly. So committee, if I can go to Councillor Park.
Thank you, and thank you to Mr. Mounteer for his wisdom. He's given it to us in previous instances, and I hope to get more wisdom from him in the future. The information that he just imparted is exactly why I put the motion on the floor at the beginning of the meeting to make sure that Planning and Environment Committee was making a statement that wasn't about zoning. I take the bit about the Middlesex Housing Corporation with a grain of salt. The intention behind that was to give the Housing Corporation access to staff to look at the articles of incorporation if any site that they are operating were to be a supervised consumption service. So if we need to move that out, and I'll take that motion to another committee where it's more appropriate, I'm happy to do so. I very clearly and intently wanting to remove barriers so that these sites can be operationalized quicker in the City of London.
Thank you for that. If I may, could I just ask staffs, if we look at C, will that happen regardless of what we say here tonight?
Well, Madam Chair, I'm not sure that you're asking the right people. Perhaps that's a question better asked to the administration that would be attending CAPS. I don't know that that would happen if there wasn't some direction, and that's from my limited knowledge. Without direction from council, I'm not sure that that specifically would happen, that administration would take those specific steps.
From what I hear, Mr. Fleming, then is that can go to another committee and it's another discussion.
Madam Chair, apologize to the clerk, but I think that's a question best directed to the clerk. So it was with respect to Clause C and whether, excuse me, that as an item that, whether that's an item that the chair was asking that should go to another committee.
Ms. Saunders?
Through Madam Chair, I think your question was, and correct me if I'm wrong, if one of the sites ultimately ends up being at a site that's operated by London Middlesex Housing Corp., if under normal course of action, the civic administration would work with the staff at the housing corporation to help them with any amendments to the shareholders, which normally we would do that in any event. If there's any changes that have to be done, we usually work with them to help them develop those. And I think that's what your question was.
Yes, it is. So that will happen in a normal course regardless. Okay, thank you for that clarification. If I could go to Councillor Usher, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I've sat here listening quietly. I didn't want to speak because I was really learning from the debate. I call it a discussion more than a debate. But what Mr. Fleming said a few minutes ago made a lot of sense to me. And what I'm hearing now with respect to going to the civic administration to get some more information also makes a lot of sense. But if I'm right, based on what Mr. Fleming said, and I'm asking the question, only one of these premises needs to go to housing because housing doesn't have anything to do with the other premise. Am I right through you, Madam Chair, to Mr. Fleming maybe? Would you know, or anyone there know? Or maybe our legal people, or maybe even the Dr. Mackey.
Dr. Mackey, would you be able to comment?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. The 241 Simcoe is an LMHC location. 446 York is not related to LMHC in any way.
So that's what I thought. So in that event, then the original motion by Councillor Park, the top one, the A, seemed, from what I'm hearing here, seemed to be able to proceed. But there is still a zoning application that needs to be made with respect to 446. In the meantime, it seems to me that we need to get some information via civic administration to work with housing, whatever way we need to do it, whether via another committee, to get housing to make some comments with respect to 241 Simcoe. And that's something that we need to get into this motion. If we're going to get this passed without a lot of discussion at council, we need to ensure that it is fine-tuned for both sides and not just for one. And first of all, and I fully agree that the A part of Councillor Park's motion should remain in place, and then we work on something else for the other two sites accordingly. But the big thing about this is, as Dr. Mackey said right at the beginning, he is running out of time and he needs to move forward with this. We can't move it immediately, it seems to me. So it's a matter of how long the zoning will take to be accomplished for 246, what we need to do that, and how long it will take for us to go through housing to get their agreement or their endorsement for Simcoe Street. And then if there's any zoning that needs to be changed there, then we need to do that. But I would just wish, and I'm sure that each of us around this horseshoe right now in this committee would like to get this moving as quickly as possible. But we can't just get it out of this committee into council and then it's done. There's some other step that needs to take place, and I think that that's what we're working through right now. And I hope that everyone understands that. And I don't mean everyone around this horseshoe, but the people who are listening to us. So it's a matter of working this out as quickly as possible and as neatly as possible. I think the clerk made a good statement. It's a matter of how we get this to another committee for Simcoe Street and move on with the zoning for York Street, if that's what we want to do.
Thank you, Councillor Usher. Mr. Fleming.
Madam Chair, I'm not sure if it's going to work out this way, but I'm going to try and be helpful here. From what I've heard from Mr. Montier, I think Clause B is problematic. And remember, Dr. Mackey came here with a couple of different requests, and one was specifically for endorsement of those two. So that's Clause B. And I think what you've heard from your legal expert is that that's not something that you should do today in terms of endorsement of those sites explicitly on the planning committee floor. I think Clause D, if I'm not mistaken, I've heard might be problematic. But with respect to Clause A and I think Clause C, and that was the one that I thought you were asking about, Madam Chair, I think whether it's planning staff or not, if A and C move forward, that's something that we as a staff would be able to deal with. It might not be planning staff. I don't know for sure whether C would actually happen as a matter of course, but I think it's good to have some clarity if that's what council wants us to do, and we'll sort out as administration as to who takes that on. Dr. Mackey already said that a neighborhood safety plan would be a positive thing in his opinion, and we could certainly move forward with that. So Clause A and C, I don't see any issue with those from what I've heard from the people that have been speaking to those.
Thank you for that. And if I can go to Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you to staff, just in terms of timing, which would be quicker, having the city initiate a zoning change or having the health unit come forward and request that?
Madam Chair, I don't think that there would be much of a difference by way of speed if it would be dependent on the health unit to submit the application. If there was some time for them to hire a planner and or whatever staff they wanted to hire and submit something, that would take some additional time that would be avoided if it was a city initiated amendment. I would suggest though this might be one that would be best coming from an applicant so that council isn't both applying and evaluating, but it's up to council whether they want to do that.
Okay, thank you. And just a further comment, of course, I'm sitting as council's representative on the community drug and alcohol strategy, and the suggestions that have been made today are all in line with that. We will be coming out with the the final plan closer to the summer.
Thank you. So we do have the motion before us. I want to just make a few comments again from the chair. I have concerns with B, and one of the concerns I have is that we don't even know if these two sites meet the criteria. I would like to have further information back from staff before we pick the sites. That I hear can be done. That information could be given to us, correct me if I'm wrong, before we are at planning to approve the zoning. And I understand we could have a further discussion about the sites at that time. And I also heard from staff about the a D, and my hesitation is about predetermining, and I hear the concern there. I think my intent with bringing this forward was to have those conversations with administration and London Middlesex Housing and the stakeholders and the shareholders agreement and the articles of incorporation that would, I think, happen as a process anyhow. I'm hesitating now that we are again predetermining, and I would like I wouldn't be supportive of B and D. I think C is important. I know our policies state that it allows us to establish a system of ongoing communication with the community. I think that is going to be very, very important. I've attended a couple of the community events that Linden Middlesex Health Unit has had, and I do think that the conversation with the community has to continue, and that has to, regardless of what site, where we go, the community around that site has to have that ongoing communication and relationship. So I'm very supportive of that part. The engagement doesn't just end here, or it doesn't end when we change our zoning policies. Regardless of where we go with this, it is important that the community be engaged, give suggestions, and be part of that education process that will continue in the community. For now, I think I'll just leave my comments. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. So I heard, through the chair, I heard what Mr. Mountier said about B, and puts us in a bit of a difficult situation. We have previously at Planning Committee dealt with a council policy related to planning for supervised consumption facilities and temporary overdose prevention sites. We dealt with that at Planning Committee. We passed it at council, and it's currently council policy. The idea of having a council policy was that we recognized that the process for planning for supervised consumption services and the process for amending the official plan and zoning bylaw were on different timelines, and that we needed to provide guidance as best as we could to the health unit, the provincial government, and the federal government about what we think around planning for supervised consumption services and temporary overdose prevention sites. That council policy was, I think, in effect before the temporary overdose prevention site was opened. I think it has been forwarded to the provincial government and Health Canada so that they understand what our policy is. It is not, and like I'm not under any false impressions that we're dealing with the zoning matter right now. We're not. And it's quite possible that in the future, somebody's going to make an amazing argument about how a zoning amendment isn't going to be good for one of these locations. I haven't heard those arguments yet, and I can possibly be closed off to them. What I can tell you is, given the council policy that we have already passed, these locations make sense to me. So if the idea is that we can't make any decisions about supporting or not supporting locations according to the council policy, I will admit to being a bit confused about why we passed a council policy at all, unless it was just to inform the decision-making of other parties who are not municipal council. I'm not sure that any other place that opens a supervised consumption service has zoning in place for the service to start operating. There are a bunch of them. I'm not sure that that is actually the order of operations. I know that land use planning decisions can be appealed, and that appeal process can take a very long time. In fact, it's one of the reasons why we moved to the local planning appeals tribunal, is that these processes can take a long time. I'm not sure that the provincial government or the federal government is going to sit around waiting for the local planning appeals tribunal to make a decision about a zoning matter before they fund and start operating supervised consumption services in the face of a public health crisis. So, I don't think we're talking about a zoning issue. I don't think anybody can be prejudiced against some future discussion about either the official plan policies or the zoning policies or the application of that to any future amendments for particular sites, because that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, does this adhere to, and how can we apply the council policy around planning for these services? I realize that it's a bit of an unusual situation, but we better figure it out, because the need in the community is very significant. being able to choose locations that are better than some other options is important in terms of how the service gets delivered. So whether we need to do it at planning committee or not, I think we can apply our own council policy to the evaluation of these locations. I've certainly followed it when I'm thinking through, is this a good location or not? I recognize that it's separate from the official plan policy and the zoning amendments for either the site or more broadly. So I would like to move forward with some kind of indication that we support these two locations, if that is in fact the belief of the council. I sent some revised language which essentially says we support these locations in accordance with the council policy that we have on the books. And so I don't know if that solves the problem that Mr. Mountier was talking about, but for the record, since it seems like we're headed towards something where people will be checking the record, I'm not talking about a zoning issue.
And if I can go to staff for a comment?
So, Madam Chair, I just spoke with Mr. Montier and asked him that very question. So we're in a bit of a combined brainwave here, but he did say that would be helpful. So I've got the specific council policy name here. And so perhaps following clause B, so the two proposed sites at 241 and 446, be endorsed in principle as appropriate locations for permanent supervised consumption services, further to council's policy on siting of supervised consumption facilities and temporary overdose prevention sites. So it's very clear that that endorsement is relating to this, and it is, in fact, for the benefit of the health unit who's come today to you to check in with you relative to that policy. And so essentially your endorsement is giving them that clarity that you think that the two sites that they brought forward meet those criteria, but it's also clarifying that it has nothing to do with zoning.
And I guess we'll have a friendly amendment then, and I'd like to go to Mayor Brown.
So I certainly see that as a good amendment, and I certainly support it as the mover of the main motion. I want to be really clear here, and I think we all need to be really clear, that we're not making a zoning decision today. And I want to say that for the public record. That's really important. But what we are doing is we are functioning as best we can in the environment that we find ourselves in. This is an exceptional circumstance, and it's something that's happening in our community and happening in communities across Canada. We're going to figure it out, but it's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride some of the time. And largely it's an order of operations piece that involves many levels of government to work together. And I think that the motion now, as amended, gets us there. I have heard from members that there's some discomfort with Part D. I'd like to leave that Part D in, but I'm willing to call portions of this motion separately. And if there is agreement on A, B, and C, B as amended, then perhaps, Chair, you could call those together. If there's still discomfort with B as amended by one or more members, then perhaps we could just deal with A and C first and then circle back to B and deal with D.
Okay, if the committee will allow me to just make a few comments, given I had a number of concerns, and I want to thank staff and Councillor Helmer there for making sure that B refers to the, that these locations meet the criteria and our policies are in place. This is not a zoning change or bylaw that will take place, but it's really important that we understand that if we are supporting these two locations, that we are making sure they meet the criteria. And therefore, D, I would feel comfortable with leaving that in as a matter of course. I think it's important that those discussions take place. If we are talking about one of the locations, which is Simcoe Street, so I am okay. I could pull out the A, B, C separate to D, but I'll look to the committee and for further comments. Councillor Park?
Thank you. I just wanted to take a moment to thank Councillor Helmer for allowing me to second this. Spent most of today writing most of that, so I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst?
Yes, Madam Chair, question through you to our legal staff. The other option, besides endorsing this in principle, was be to say that the council doesn't object to these sites. Is that any way put us in a safer position?
I'm not sure if that question was directed to staff, I assume. If I
Yes,
could
I'm
go
sorry,
to
I
Mr.
suggested to legal.
Mr. Montier?
Thank you, through the chair. I believe that the Part B of the resolution, with the changes that Mr. Fleming has promoted, based on the information from Councillor Helmer, which is very helpful, satisfies me that this is not in any way to be construed as a planning decision, but it is simply, as Councillor Helmer pointed out, it's council applying the policy and based on that policy, providing information to the decision makers, principally the health unit and others, in their process going forward.
Thank you for that. And I see Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to reiterate what many people have already said, that we've done a lot of good work here, and we've come to a really good point, I believe. And I believe if there was any belief by anyone on anybody's part that this was a zoning decision we were making tonight, all they have to see is that we never even entertained number 2 in Dr. Mackey's request, that we just deem this zone, because we know that that's not something we can do. And so I believe the fact that we are recognizing that these 2 sites fit with the council policy that we created a while ago, I think that's a really good direction for us to take. And I believe that allows the health unit and regional HIV/AIDS connection to move forward with the application process and help us to implement these harm reduction services so we can start saving lives in the City of London.
Thank you for that. And with that, if the committee will allow me then to just sum up, and I want to thank the committee for this discussion. I think it's a very important discussion. I know it's not an easy discussion. I know the public has reached out to us and given their comments, and I know we've taken those comments and we've heard a lot from the public, and I do think this engagement with the community has to continue. I want to thank Dr. Mackey and the health unit for all the work that's being done. And I just want to say on behalf of, just being a member of the London Middlesex Housing Corporation, I know it was a discussion and it was something that the Housing Corporation felt very passionately about, wanting to be part of the solution, not part of the problem as it relates to the Simcoe site. So with that, I'll ask for a vote. Sorry, Councillor Helmer. Oh. Councillor Usher, I'm going. You're not. Councillor Usher.
I just wanted to know, thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to know if you were going to revise the B to add the items that Mr. Fleming talked about before you vote on this.
I understand it has it in there. If you press current item. And I just want to just go over, we'll be voting on A to D, inclusive. I will not be pulling anything out. Councillor Helmer?
Yeah, I just want to point out, I think Councillor Usher is experiencing the same issue as everyone who's looking on the screens, which is what's up on the screen is not what's actually in front of us. So if we could just refresh that, I think it's the presentation screen. The B is different.
There it is. And is it on the screen? I think it's important that the public see what we're voting on here. Councillor Cassidy?
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Through you, Madam Chair, to the clerk, I believe. Do we have to also receive the delegation from Dr. Mackey, or did we vote on that already?
We can do a B noted that a delegation was received by Dr. Mackey.
We just added the Dr. Mackey's presentation in there for you.
And if we can have the vote opened.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5 with 1 recused.
Okay, and I will turn the chair back to the chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. And so, with that, brings us too close to the end of the meeting. I would seek item number 4, any items for direction? Seeing none. Any deferred matters or additional business? Seeing none, I'll take a motion for adjournment. Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. All in favor? All say aye. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.